October 732. You are standing on a hill in the middle of what will one day be called France. The trees around you are going bare. The morning is cold enough to see your breath. Below you, stretched across the plain, is the largest army assembled on European soil since the fall of Rome. Its cavalry numbers in the tens of thousands. Its soldiers have not lost a major campaign in 100 years. They have crossed 3 continents. They have shattered empires. They reached you from a city called Mecca, 5,000 kilometers away, in less than a single human lifetime. And they are about to charge. Behind you, Frankish infantry. Axes. Shields. Cold feet. No cavalry worth mentioning. No siege engines. No elaborate battle plan beyond a single idea: hold the line. What happens in the next 7 days will determine whether the language spoken in Paris, in London, in Madrid, in Rome is Arabic or Latin. Whether the dominant institution shaping European culture for the next 1,000 years is the Catholic Church or the Umayyad Caliphate. Whether the civilization that will eventually produce the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the modern nation-state, is the one that emerged from this hill, or something entirely different. Most people do not know this battle happened. Most who do believe it was a minor skirmish, inflated by nationalist historians trying to build a myth. They are wrong. The Battle of Tours is one of the 10 most consequential military engagements in human history. And the reason it does not feel that way is precisely because it was won, because the world it protected continued to exist, and worlds that continue to exist forget the moments when they almost did not. This is that moment. To understand what happened at Tours, you must start not in France but in Arabia, and not in 732 but a full century earlier. In the year 622, a merchant named Muhammad left the city of Mecca for the city of Medina. This journey, the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar because it marks the moment when a religious movement became a political entity, a state, a military force with a coherent identity and a shared purpose that no collection of mercenaries or conscripts could manufacture. When Muhammad returned to Mecca in 630 and unified the Arabian Peninsula under Islam, he had done something that had never been done before: taken a collection of warring desert tribes, speaking the same language, sharing the same landscape, fighting the same pointless feuds for centuries, and made them one. When he died in 632, the energy he had created did not dissipate. It accelerated. His successors, the Rashidun Caliphs, launched an expansion that remains one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in recorded history. Within 10 years of his death, they had conquered Persia, the Sassanid Empire that had stood for 4 centuries, that had fought Rome to a standstill across multiple generations, that had resources and military experience the Arabian tribes could not match on paper. They matched it anyway. They stripped the Byzantine Empire of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, its wealthiest and most productive provinces. They pushed into North Africa. They moved with a speed that the great empires of the ancient world had never managed, because those empires had fought for territory. These forces were fighting for something more difficult to quantify and far more powerful: certainty. They believed what they were doing was right. That certainty, properly directed by capable commanders, is the most dangerous military quality in existence. By 661, the Umayyad dynasty had taken control of the Caliphate and accelerated the expansion further. By 670, they were in modern Tunisia. By 698, Carthage, the great ancient city, now a major Byzantine stronghold, had fallen. By 705, all of North Africa was under Umayyad control. They had covered the entire southern Mediterranean coast in less than 70 years. 70 years. From Mecca to Casablanca. And then they looked across the water. In the spring of 711, a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa to the southern tip of Europe with approximately 7,000 men. He landed near a rock that still bears his name today. In Arabic, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. You know it as Gibraltar. What followed was not a conquest. It was a collapse. The Visigoth kingdom of Spain had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 2 centuries. It had sophisticated law codes, established administrative structures, and a population that had absorbed the best of Roman civilization. On paper, it should have been a formidable defender. It was not. The Visigoths were internally divided by succession disputes. Their aristocracy was fractured by rival factions that cared more about defeating each other than about any external threat. Their army had been weakened by decades of civil conflict that had consumed resources and eroded the cohesion that made fighting forces function. Tariq's initial force, and the much larger army of 18,000 that followed under Musa ibn Nusayr, did not defeat the Visigoths so much as they dismantled them. The last Visigoth king, Roderick, died at the Battle of Guadalete in 711. His army did not simply lose, it ceased to exist as a coherent military entity. Within 3 years, the Visigoth kingdom was effectively finished. By 718, the Umayyad forces controlled virtually all of the Iberian Peninsula, from the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic, from Gibraltar to the Ebro River. They had crossed from Africa to Europe and conquered a kingdom the size of Spain and Portugal combined in 7 years. Now there was one natural barrier left between them and the heart of Western Europe: the Pyrenees. They crossed those too. In 719, Umayyad forces took the city of Narbonne in southern Gaul, the first permanent foothold north of the mountains. In 721, they pushed northwest toward Toulouse and were beaten back by a Frankish governor named Odo in one of the very few successful defensive actions of the period. But a check at Toulouse was not the end of anything. The momentum was too great, the institutional confidence too deep. The forces regrouped, redirected, and pushed elsewhere. Raiding parties went deeper and deeper into Gaul. By 725 they had reached Autun in Burgundy, deep into what had been the Roman heartland. Columns penetrated to within 100 kilometers of Paris. They sacked churches, monasteries, and market towns that had no military protection. They carried off plunder on a scale that had not been seen in Western Europe since the worst years of the Roman collapse. The Frankish response to all of this was inadequate. The Merovingian kings who nominally ruled the Frankish territories were by this point almost entirely ceremonial figures. Real power rested with the mayor of the palace, and the succession to that position had been contested and violent for years. The Frankish military was capable and experienced, but it had no unified command, no coherent strategy, and no political authority capable of organizing a response commensurate to the threat. Except one man was about to change all of that. His name was Charles. He was the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the palace under the Merovingian kings, the real military and political power in the kingdom. When Pepin died in 714, a brutal succession war broke out. Charles was imprisoned by his enemies. His death was not only possible but probably intended. He escaped. And then he fought everyone. Over the next 8 years, Charles crushed every rival faction within the Frankish territories. He defeated the Neustrians, the Western Franks who opposed him, at Amblève in 716 and Vincy in 717. He systematically reduced the other Frankish noble houses until there was effectively only one faction left his. Then he turned to the external enemies who had taken advantage of the succession chaos. The Saxons in the northeast, the Frisians along the coast, the Alemanni in the south, the Bavarians in the southeast. He fought them all. He beat them all. By 732, Charles controlled a unified Frankish kingdom stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Rhine and beyond. He held his position not through royal title. The Merovingian fiction was still politically useful, and he maintained it, but through absolute military authority. There was no commander in Western Europe more capable. There was no army more battle-tested than the force he had assembled. He was the most dangerous man in Europe. And Odo, the governor who had beaten the Muslims at Toulouse but been shattered at the Garonne, had come to ask for his help. Their meeting was complicated. Charles and Odo were not friends. Odo had previously allied with Umayyad clients against Charles in earlier conflicts, a political calculation that had made short-term sense and long-term catastrophe. Now Odo was presenting himself as a suppliant. He had no army. He had no leverage. His territories were being overrun. He needed Charles. Charles had one condition, and it was non-negotiable: Odo would submit to Frankish authority. His duchy would come under Charles's political control. The price of military help was political surrender. Odo accepted. He had no alternative. Charles gathered his forces with a speed that by the standards of the era was remarkable. He moved heavy infantry across hundreds of kilometers in weeks. He did not move toward Abd al-Rahman's army. He moved toward a specific piece of ground that he had selected in advance. This decision, the choice of terrain, was the most important thing Charles Martel did at Tours. More important than the battle itself. More important than any tactical decision made during the fighting. Charles understood something that many commanders of his era did not. Cavalry wins on flat ground. The Umayyad cavalry that had destroyed Odo at the Garonne was not invincible. It was invincible in the conditions that made it effective: open ground, room to build speed, the ability to flank and encircle. Change those conditions and you change the outcome. He selected the high ground between the Vienne and Clan rivers, north of Poitiers, on the main road to Tours. The position had everything he needed. Approaching from the south required moving through broken wooded terrain, where horses could not reach full speed before impact. The elevation meant any charge was uphill, which further reduced momentum. The rivers on the east and west protected his flanks from the wide encircling movements that had destroyed so many armies before. And the tree line immediately behind the Frankish position provided a fallback option that Charles never intended to use, but that gave his men psychological security. You could not be encircled. There was somewhere to go if the worst happened. He deployed his army in a dense formation on the high ground and sent scouts south to confirm the Umayyad advance. Abd al-Rahman came. Now we must understand what Abd al-Rahman saw when he arrived in front of the Frankish position. He was a disciplined, experienced commander who had not survived a century of Umayyad military culture by being reckless. He studied the ground carefully. He sent cavalry to probe the tree lines and assess the terrain. He walked the approach routes himself, understanding what his horses would face on the slope. He saw the rivers on the flanks. He saw the elevation. He saw the trees. He did not like what he saw. He had options. He could wait. Cavalry that cannot supply itself for long in enemy territory has a time limit, but so does infantry that has marched hundreds of kilometers. He could attempt a wider flanking movement, finding a route around the river lines. He could fall back to more favorable terrain and force Charles to follow him onto ground where the cavalry could operate freely. He chose to attack. This decision has puzzled historians for 300 years. Abd al-Rahman was not reckless. He was not stupid. He was not making an obvious mistake. The most probable explanation requires understanding what a century of unbroken victories does to an army's institutional psychology. His cavalry had never been stopped. Not by the Persians. Not by the Byzantines. Not by the Visigoths. Not by Odo at the Garonne. Every time the charge had gone forward, the line had broken. The terrain at Tours was suboptimal, but the Frankish infantry was still infantry. And infantry, from the perspective of veteran cavalry commanders who had destroyed 10 infantry armies in a row, was something you broke. It was not a peer threat. It was an obstacle that required sufficient force and sufficient will. The terrain would reduce the speed of the charge. The discipline of his soldiers would compensate. They always had. On the 7th day, believed by modern historians to have been Saturday, October 10, 732, though the precise date has been debated since the 18th century, Abd al-Rahman launched his cavalry in a massive frontal assault against the Frankish position. The Franks did not break. The first charge did not break them. The second did not break them. Through the morning and into the afternoon, wave after wave of Umayyad cavalry crashed against the Frankish shield wall, and the wall absorbed every charge. A chronicle written within years of the battle, the source historians call the Continuations of Fredegar, uses an image that has never been improved upon in 13 centuries of historical writing. The Franks stood, it says, like a wall of ice, like a glacier. The charges broke against them and ran back down the slope, and the glacier was still there. This is not poetry. It is mechanical description of what happens when cavalry charges uphill through trees into a locked shield formation. The physics are simple and brutal. A horse that cannot build full speed cannot generate the momentum needed to shatter a disciplined formation. It hits the wall of shields and stops, or it shies away at the last moment. Horses are not suicidal, and they will not willingly run into a wall of steel. The men with axes and spears are right there. The exposed rider is right there. The charge breaks. The cavalry pulls back. The wall is still there. Charles was managing this process with a precision that accounts of the battle consistently underestimate. He was not simply standing in place waiting for the enemy to tire. He was rotating fresh units from the rear into the forward line to replace exhausted soldiers. He was monitoring both flanks for any attempt at encirclement. He was enforcing the single most important discipline in this kind of engagement, no pursuit. This is where infantry commanders lose their battles. The cavalry charges, the charge fails, the cavalry pulls back, and the infantry, blood running hot from the contact, breaks formation to chase the retreating horsemen. And the horsemen wheel, reform in seconds, and come back at a formation that is now scattered, gaps everywhere, no longer a wall but a collection of individuals. Charles forbade it. Every time the Umayyad cavalry pulled back, the Frankish line held in place. The men who wanted to chase were held. The formation remained tight. The glacier did not pursue. This continued through the day. Then the rumour spread. The accounts differ in detail. This is characteristic of all eyewitness history from the period where what people saw and what they understood were often different things. But every source agrees on the substance. During the height of the fighting, word reached elements of the Umayyad army that Frankish forces had penetrated their rear and were attacking the supply camp. This was not a trivial piece of news. The supply camp contained the accumulated plunder of the entire campaign through southern Gaul. Gold and silver from Bordeaux, silk and luxury goods from the estates of the Frankish nobility, livestock, religious artifacts taken from churches and monasteries across the region. Months of campaigning. The material reward that made the risk of the campaign worthwhile. For soldiers who had marched from the Pyrenees and fought through the heat of October expecting to emerge wealthy, this was not an abstraction. This was their lives. Their futures, the reason they had come. Units began breaking away from the assault to return to the camp. Others, seeing cavalry moving toward the rear, did what soldiers in any army do when they see comrades moving away from the fighting. They assumed a command had been given, that a retreat had been ordered, and they followed. The breakdown of information in the noise and chaos of a sustained engagement is total. You cannot ask questions. You can only observe and react. And what they observed was other soldiers moving away from the enemy. The retreat that had started as individual decisions became, with terrifying speed, collective. Abd al-Rahman saw it happening. He rode toward the collapse, trying by force of personal presence and authority to stop it. Every account we have, Arab and Frankish, describes him throwing himself physically into the path of the retreat, striking men, shouting commands, trying to reform units that were already dissolving. He rode into a pocket of Frankish infantry. He did not come out. The moment Abd al-Rahman fell, whatever remained of the Umayyad formation ceased to exist as a coherent military force. The retreat became complete. The cavalry disengaged from the Frankish position along the entire line. Supporting elements fell back. The army that had never been stopped began moving south, away from the hill, away from the wall of ice that had refused to yield. Charles Martel did not pursue. The decision to hold position as darkness fell is arguably the second most important decision he made at Tours. Night pursuit into terrain you do not fully control, against cavalry that has not been destroyed but only repulsed, with soldiers who have been fighting all day. This is how victories become catastrophes. The cavalry reforms in the dark. It finds your pursuit columns strung out and exhausted. What looked like a rout becomes a massacre. Charles held his men in formation on the hill. He waited. In the morning his scouts reported what they found: nothing. An empty camp. Abandoned tents and equipment. The dead from the day before, still on the ground where they had fallen. No army. Silence. He held his position for the rest of that day as well, convinced it was a trap. He sent cavalry reconnaissance in force, large enough to fight if the trap was real. They came back with the same report. The Umayyad army was gone. It had gathered what it could carry in the night and marched south toward the Pyrenees. The Battle of Tours was over. Now, what had actually been decided? The immediate answer seems obvious. The Muslim advance into Western Europe had been stopped. Charles had won. The Franks had held. The Umayyads had retreated. But stop there. And think. What was the Umayyad advance in 732? It was not a raid. It was not a punitive expedition. It was the latest stage of a campaign of permanent conquest that had been underway for a century and had never failed. Abd al-Rahman was not raiding Gaul for plunder and then going home, though plunder was taken. He was extending the territory of the Umayyad Caliphate north of the Pyrenees, establishing control over population centres, building the administrative foundation of permanent rule. The forces that had preceded him had already taken Narbonne and held it for years. They had established a permanent presence in what is now southern France. The trajectory of the campaign pointed north, toward the Frankish heartland, toward the political structures that controlled everything above the Loire. Tours stopped that trajectory. Not permanently in the absolute sense. The Umayyads continued to hold Narbonne for another 27 years, and further raids occurred. But the strategic campaign to absorb Gaul ended on that hill. It never resumed with the same commitment or the same capable leadership. The moment was lost. The momentum was broken. The man who had led it was dead. And Charles Martel emerged from Tours as something entirely new in Western Europe, an undisputed military authority whose power no one could rationally contest. He had done what the Visigoths could not do, what the Byzantines, fighting similar threats on their eastern front, struggled to do on their best days, what every Frankish leader before him had failed to do. He had met the most feared military force in the world and broken it. The political consequences cascaded immediately. His authority over the Frankish territories was beyond challenge. His reputation reached Constantinople. It reached Rome. It reached the courts of every ruler in Europe who understood what had just happened on that hill. This matters because of what came next. It was Charles Martel who stabilized the Frankish kingdom that his grandson Charlemagne would transform into the Carolingian Empire. It was Charles who built the military and political foundation on which everything else rested. And the Carolingian Empire, the political entity that Charlemagne built on Charles's foundation, is where modern Europe begins. Not metaphorically. Structurally. When Charlemagne's empire was divided among his three grandsons in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the map produced by that division looks, to a startling degree, like the political map of modern Western Europe. The western portion, given to Charles the Bald, became France. The eastern portion, given to Louis the Germanic, became Germany. The disputes over the central corridor between them produced 1,000 years of conflict whose final resolution came in the 20th century. Modern Europe is not born in Rome. It is born in the Carolingian Empire, and the Carolingian Empire is born in the military authority of Charles Martel. And Charles Martel's authority is established on a hill in central France in October of 732. Follow the chain. And there is another chain that almost never gets discussed. Because the Catholic Church, the institution that shaped European culture more profoundly than any other single force between the 5th and 16th centuries, survives because of Tours. At the time of the battle, the Church was the only pan-European institution with organizational coherence. But it had no military power. It depended entirely on the protection of secular rulers. The Merovingian kings were politically declining. The Byzantines were geographically distant and theologically estranged. There was no secular power in the West capable of protecting the Church's institutional existence, except Charles Martel, and only after Tours gave him the authority to act as the protector of Western Christianity. His son Pepin formalized the alliance with the papacy. His grandson Charlemagne made it permanent, sponsoring the monasteries that copied manuscripts, the scholars that transmitted ancient learning, the educational infrastructure that preserved what remained of classical civilization through the darkest centuries of the medieval period. Without Tours, there is no Carolingian protection of the Church. Without Carolingian protection, the monasteries that preserved ancient texts are far more vulnerable. Without those monasteries and their manuscripts, the tradition that eventually produced the Renaissance, the recovery of classical learning that transformed European intellectual culture in the 15th and 16th centuries, becomes radically uncertain. From Aristotle to the Renaissance, the chain passes through a Carolingian monastery. The chain passes through Charlemagne. Charlemagne passes through Charles Martel. Charles Martel passes through 1 week in October of 732. But history is not a simple chain. And before this becomes too neat, one thing needs to be said. The numbers in this story have been debated for 13 centuries, and the debate matters because the drama of Tours has sometimes been used to support claims the evidence cannot sustain. The title of this video says 1,500 Franks against 80,000. That represents the most dramatic version of the available historical accounts. The Arab chronicles of the period describe Umayyad forces in numbers ranging from 60,000 to 400,000, figures almost certainly exaggerated to magnify the subsequent defeat. The Frankish chronicles describe comparable numbers on the opposing side, equally exaggerated to magnify the victory. Modern historians, working from logistical calculations, how many men a given region in 732 could supply, how many cavalry horses could be fed from the available fodder, how long a column of given size would take to pass through the mountain passes, estimate the Umayyad force at somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000, with the cavalry component being the decisive element. The Frankish force was probably between 15,000 and 30,000 heavy infantry. These are not small numbers. This was not a minor skirmish. But why does the dramatic version, the vast disparity, the impossible odds persist? Because what happened at Tours was genuinely shocking to the people who witnessed it. Not because the numbers were supernatural, because the outcome was. An Umayyad cavalry force, the instrument that had shattered every formation it had ever engaged, failed to break a Frankish infantry line. In 100 years of expansion, this had never happened. The shock was real, even if the numbers were not. And the chroniclers who wrote about it within years of the battle understood that they were recording something historically decisive. The exaggeration was not dishonesty. It was emphasis. They wanted future readers to feel what they had felt watching it, that something enormous had been decided, that the world had turned on that hill. They were correct. The real lesson of Tours is not the tactical detail of the shield wall, or the cavalry charges, or the rumour about the supply camp. Those are the mechanisms. The real lesson is what the battle reveals about how history actually changes direction. It does not change in parliaments. It does not change in treaties or in the slow grinding of cultural evolution. It changes in a single week, on a particular piece of ground, because one man chose the right terrain and refused to move. Charles Martel did not know he was saving Western civilization. He knew he was trying to stop a very dangerous army from taking more territory. He was trying to secure his political position against a threat that, if it succeeded, would cost him everything he had built. He was honouring an alliance he had extracted painful political concessions to create. He was a political operator as much as a military commander, and his motivations were as complicated and impure as human motivations always are. And yet the consequence of his decisions on that hill in October 732 reaches forward to this moment, to the world you live in now, to the languages spoken in this video, to the borders on every map you have ever looked at, to the institutions, the laws, the culture, the intellectual inheritance that shapes every conversation happening in every university in the Western world. One battle, 1 week, one wall that refused to break. The question historians still argue about, and I want to leave you with it, is this: if Tours had gone the other way, what would have changed? Some historians argue not that the forces of Christian European culture were too deeply rooted to be permanently displaced, that the population of Gaul, Romanized, Christian, administratively sophisticated, would have absorbed Muslim rule as it had absorbed Visigothic rule and produced something hybrid, something new, but not the end of European civilization. Others argue everything, that the Frankish state was the only political structure in the West with the organizational capacity to resist and recover, that without Charles Martel's victory and the political authority it created, the Carolingian project was impossible, that without the Carolingian project, the preservation of ancient knowledge, the development of medieval institutions, the eventual emergence of everything we call the Western world, all of it becomes contingent on events that may or may not have unfolded. No one knows. History does not run its experiments twice. What we know is what happened. The wall held. The commander fell. The army retreated in the night. And a civilization continued that would 1,000 years later reshape the entire world. A man with a hammer chose a hill in October. And here we are. If this changed how you see this period, leave a comment below. What do you think would have changed if that wall had broken? Like and subscribe. There is still much of this history left to tell.